I have told this story exactly once before tonight, and that was to a review board on a cord station that needed a formal account, not the truth. What I am about to put down here is the truth. It will not be orderly. The review board did not get the part about the way the cold came in through, the broken lintel, or what her eyes looked like when I changed the dressing the second time, or the particular quality of the silence between us on the second night when she finally stopped, pretending she was not in pain. The review board got dates and treatment notes and a clinical description of the injuries, and they were satisfied. I am not satisfied. I am writing this because I am 61 years old, and I have been a field medic for 34 of those years, and I have never once written anything down that wasn't a treatment record, and this needs to be written down while the details still feel the way they felt, before time does what time always does and smooths everything into a shape that is easier to carry. The Kethavar Citadel sits at 11,000 feet in the Andhra Thale border ridge, and in the years before the Thale column pushed through the Karev Gap, it had been a neutral medical post, one of 4 that the Accord had placed. Along that ridge under the covenant of neutral station, which means very little when one of the signatories decides a strategic corridor is worth more than a covenant. I had been posted there for 7 months. My name is Corvin Hest. I was at the time a senior field medic attached to the Accord Humanitarian Corps, which is a dignified way of saying I had no military rank, no weapon, a blue stripe on my sleeve that was supposed to mean something to anyone who chose a hard morning and didn't, and a medical kit that I repacked every day out of habit because repacking it was the one thing I could control. There were 6 of us at Kethavar when the Thale column arrived. Myself, 2 junior medics named Dasav and Ora, a logistic coordinator named Pelin, who was 3 months from retirement and spoke about it constantly in the way that men do when they need to, believe in something specific, a cook named One, who had survived 4 postings and could sleep through anything, and a communications officer named Breath, who had not slept through anything in living memory, and whose expressions of alarm I had learned to calibrate on a sliding scale from mild to sincere. When Breath used the word significant without any qualifier, you had roughly 4 minutes before something became your problem. Breathy came to the treatment bay at what I will say was 3 in the morning, though the chronometer in the bay had been running 6 minutes fast since the previous autumn, and I had never gotten around to correcting it. He said significant without any qualifier. That was the morning of the 9th day of the month of Terath, and it was the morning I met her. I should describe the citadel first because it matters. Kethavar was old, not Accord built, not even compact built in the modern sense. The outer walls were Ondrath stonework from an earlier age, pale gray granite cut in the interlocking style the old compact masons favored, where no 2 blocks are parallel and the joints are so fine you can barely pass a knife between them. The Accord had built the medical wing as an extension off the eastern face, glass and prefabricated alloy paneling that looked genuinely embarrassed to be attached to those walls, as if it knew it was temporary and the stone would outlast it by 1,000 years. The medical wing had 12 beds, a supply cabinet I had argued with Accord Logistics about for 4 of my 7 months, a surgical bay, and a small anteroom we used for patient intake that had one of the original Ondrath windows, a narrow arch of very old pale glass that distorted everything outside into something that resembled a painting more than a view. The Thale column came in through the Karev Gap and took the outer court of the citadel without significant resistance, because there was no resistance to offer. We were a medical post. The blue stripe was supposed to mean something. The column's lead officer, a tall Thale officer with the rank insignia of a secondary commander, which, in the Thale hierarchy, means approximately the 9th level in a 15-level structure, which itself tells you something about how thoroughly the Thale have committed to bureaucratic exactness even in their military, informed Pelin via a translator that the Accord covenant of neutral station was being respected in form, meaning they would not eject us or harm the post, but that the outer court and the approach road were now under Thale operational control for the duration of what he called a temporary repositioning. Pellin wrote all of this down in his log with the careful handwriting of a man who plans to have it entered into a formal record somewhere, which I respected. What the column's secondary commander did not explain, and what we pieced together over the following 6 hours, was that they were carrying wounded of their own and were using Kethavar as a medical staging point whether we cooperated or not. This is a distinction that matters in Accord law and matters very little at 3 in the morning on a mountain. They brought their wounded in through the outer gate on stretchers and in automated carriers. And we treated them because that is what we were there to do, and also because it was the only sensible thing. At some point between the 4th and 5th hour of the Thale presence, Dasov found me in the surgical bay and said there was someone in the eastern ward who had come in with the Thale movement, but was not Thale. He said it in the particular careful way that junior medics use when they have noticed something that seems significant but are not sure it is their place to name it. I followed him to the eastern ward. She was on the 3rd bed from the window. The eastern ward had 6 beds, and at that moment 4 of them held Thale soldiers in various states of repair, and the other one held one who had been asked to vacate the kitchen when the column arrived and had gone to sleep in the nearest available horizontal space with the equanimity of a man who has learned that the universe is indifferent to his preferences and has made his peace with this. The woman on the 3rd bed was dressed in what appeared at first to be civilian travel wear, a dark gray canvas coat, heavier than the season called for, the kind of thing you wear when you expect to sleep outside and need something that works as a blanket. There was a secondary layer underneath that I could not immediately identify. Her hair was dark copper, cut close on the sides and longer at the crown, and it was damp, which meant she had been outside in the mist that comes in off the ridge most nights, at altitude. Her eyes were pale, a silver so light it read almost as gray in the ward's overhead panels, and they were open, and they were watching me with an attention that I can only describe as professional. Not frightened, not in the particular way that people who are frightened pretend not to be. Something more focused than that, assessment. The injury was a deep laceration along the lower left ribs, sealed imperfectly with a field dressing that had been applied by someone who knew what they were doing but had been working under constraints. Poor light, probably movement, possibly both. There was some bruising along the left shoulder that suggested a fall or a collision rather than a strike. Her breathing was careful and deliberate, which told me the rib injury was worse than the dressing suggested, and she had already figured out exactly how to minimize the pain cost of each breath, which requires a specific kind of mental composure that most people in significant pain do not have. I introduced myself. I told her my name, my rank with the Corps, that she was in the Accord medical post at Kethavar Citadel, that the post was under Accord neutrality protections, and that I would need to remove the field dressing and assess the wound. She looked at me through the whole of this and said nothing. Then she said, in heavily accented but grammatically precise Accord standard, that she understood and that she was grateful for the care, and that she did not have a name she could give me at present. I had been a field medic for 27 years at that point. I had worked in refugee corridors, the aftermath of 3 separate fleet engagements, in 2 insurgency theaters where the politics were sufficiently complicated that I had eventually stopped trying to understand them and concentrated on the medicine. I had met people in circumstances where giving their name was dangerous, and I had met people who had lost their names to trauma and had not found them again. And I had met people who had names but had made a calculation that strangers did not them. I told her that was fine. I told her I would call her nothing at all if she preferred, and she could call me Hest, because that was what people in field posts tended to call me regardless of what I offered. She looked at me for a moment with those silver gray eyes, and something in her expression shifted very slightly. Not a softening exactly, but an adjustment the way a person revises an estimate. She said, "Hest, just that." Then she let me remove the dressing. The laceration was 5 centimeters, clean-edged, already partially closed by the field dressing, but needing proper closure and irrigation. I worked in silence, and she did not make a sound. I have worked on people who did not make a sound, and it is not always a sign of composure. Sometimes it is shock. Sometimes it is a dissociation the body produces to get through something it cannot otherwise manage. What she was doing was neither of those. She was simply enduring it with a quality of deliberate stillness that I found, and I am setting this down honestly, remarkable. When I finished the closure and began wrapping the dressing, she finally exhaled, slowly, and I had the sense it was the first genuinely relaxed breath she had allowed herself since the injury. I told her about the rib. She said she was aware. I told her I needed to assess the extent. She said, "Do what you need to do," so I did. 2 ribs had small fractures, not displaced, the kind that heal with time and care and the absence of further mechanical stress. The bruising on the shoulder was impact bruising, nothing structural. Given all of it, she was, in pure physical terms, repairable. Given the altitude and the cold, and whatever she had been through before she arrived in that ward, she was also running on something that was not quite pure physiology, and I recognized it because I had seen it before in people who carry a weight of responsibility so large they simply do not have the option of feeling their own pain until the thing they are responsible for is resolved. The body becomes functional rather than felt, a tool the will is using. I gave her what I could for the pain, which was not as much as I would have liked, because I was conserving supplies for the unknown duration of the Thale presence. She accepted it without comment. I told her she needed to stay horizontal for at minimum the next 12 hours, and that the ribs would need 4 to 6 weeks. She said she understood. I asked if there was anyone I should notify. She looked at the window, the Ondrath glass, distorting the dark outside into blurred shapes, and said no, there was no one to notify. I accepted this and went back to the work the Thale wounded required. And I did not think about her in any particular way for the next 2 hours. The Thale column's secondary commander found me at what my unreliable chronometer said was 7 in the morning and told me through his translator that the post would remain under Thale operational control for the duration of an ongoing tactical situation, and that all Accord personnel would be confined to the medical wing. He was very correct about it. He had the manner of a man who wants the record to show that he followed procedure. I told him I had patients in the Eastern Ward and needed continued access. He said yes, the medical personnel could access the wards. He did not appear to know specifically about the woman in the 3rd bed, or if he did not mention her. That morning I learned something. One of the Thale soldiers I was treating, a young man with a shrapnel wound in his left forearm, more frightened than his wound warranted, which is a thing that happens to soldiers when the situation around them is more frightening than whatever has happened to their body, let slip, in the way that young, frightened men sometimes do, that the column had been retreating, not repositioning, retreating. The Karev gap had been held by an Ondrath unit that had extracted a very significant toll, and what remained of the Thale movement was consolidating at Kethavar, because the next defensible position was 30 kilometers north and the gap was no longer passable. He was not supposed to tell me this. I thanked him and said nothing useful in return, which is the only currency a medic in a neutral post has. What this meant practically was that the Thale column was not passing through. It was staying, and so was I. I went back to the Eastern Ward at midday with food and a fresh assessment of her dressings. She was exactly where I had left her. She had not slept. The food was poor. Field rations one had salvaged from what the Thale had not requisitioned, and she ate it with the careful attention of someone who is fueling a machine rather than eating a meal. I sat on the edge of the adjacent bed and wrote in my treatment log, and she watched me write in the particular way that people watch you when they are deciding how much to trust you. She asked what I was writing. I told her, treatment notes, condition on first presentation, Dressing change, pain management, rest recommendation, she said. Nothing else. I said, nothing else is medically relevant. She looked at me for a moment and then said, very quietly, good. We did not speak at great length that afternoon. She slept eventually. The pain medication, which was modest, combined with 2 days of whatever she had been through before the Citadel, pulled her under despite herself, and I sat at the intake desk in the anteroom and listened to the sound of the Thale column in the outer court, and did my accounting of supplies, and wrote my notes and thought about what I was looking at. The secondary layer I had not been able to identify on first presentation was, upon closer examination, an inner garment of very fine material, not anything I recognized from standard compact civilian wear. The quality of it was extraordinary, the kind of thing that does not come from a market or a supply chain. It was made for one body and made to last. The dressing that had been applied to the original wound was military-grade field work, not civilian, and the technique was one I recognized from compact medical bulletins as standard Ondrath field training. She had been treated by someone trained by the Ondrath compact military before she arrived here, or she had been trained herself. There was also the matter of the scar on her left wrist. It was not recent, years old, pale against the warm pale gold of her skin, healed clean. It was a pattern rather than an accidental mark. 3 small lines at specific intervals, the kind of marking that is made deliberately. I had seen a diagram of something similar in a medical bulletin that had circulated among Accord Corps medics approximately 4 years prior. The bulletin had been about identifying physical markers relevant to emergency medical treatment of Ondrath nationals, because some physical characteristics of the Ondrath royal family line were medically significant in ways that a field medic needed to know. Specific drug interactions, specific physiological differences in pain response, a higher baseline resting temperature. The scar pattern in that bulletin had been listed under the heading Ondrath Throne Succession Markers, Traditional, applied to successive heirs at the ceremony of investiture. Not decorative, genealogical, permanent. I did not look at the scar again. I wrote nothing about it in my notes. I went to sleep in the chair in the anteroom, which was not comfortable, and I was back in the eastern ward before she woke. The second day was the long one. The cold came in more thoroughly through the broken lintel. The Thale entrance had cracked the seal on the east face of the wing and the mountain. Air at that altitude has an ambition to it, a way of finding every imperfection in a structure and making itself at home. I found a spare thermal sheet and wedged it against the worst of the gap, which helped somewhat. Dasev brought more rations. Ora tended the Thale wounded. Pellin wrote in his log with the steady application of a man who has decided that the accurate recording of events is his personal contribution to eventual justice. One slept through the morning and then appeared at the door of the eastern ward with an expression of mild offense at the general situation, assessed it, and went away to do something practical. She was sitting up when I came in, which she was not supposed to be. I told her so. She said she had been lying flat for 14 hours and her tolerance for it had expired. I pointed out that the ribs had a different opinion. She said she was aware of the ribs' opinion. There was something almost dry in the way she said it. Not quite humor, but an acknowledgement that the situation was absurd, and she was choosing to engage with it on those terms. I adjusted the pillow behind her and told her the compromise was sitting up was permissible if she stayed still, and told me immediately if the pain changed character, she said. Character, I said. If it becomes sharp instead of dull, or if breathing becomes difficult, or if your left side feels different than it does now. She said she understood. I believed her. She struck me as a person who, when she said she understood, genuinely did. I changed the dressing on the second morning. This was the part I mentioned to the review board in the most minimal clinical terms, and will describe here more honestly. The laceration was healing correctly. The closure had held. No infection had established. The irrigation had been timely, but removing and replacing the dressing over fractured ribs is not a comfortable process, regardless of how carefully It is done, and the medication I had been able to spare was not adequate to cover it entirely. She endured the whole procedure in silence, which I expected by then. What I did not expect was that halfway through the rebandaging, when I was working at the point of greatest mechanical pressure on the fractures, she looked at me directly, not at the ceiling, not at the wall, but at my face, and held eye contact throughout the worst of it. I do not know if she did it as a form of self-management, using a fixed point the way some patients do, or whether it was something else. I kept my hands steady and my expression neutral and worked as quickly as I could without sacrificing care. And when it was done, she exhaled slowly and said, "Thank you, Hest," with the precision she brought to every word. We spoke more that day, not in long runs but in fragments, the way people speak when they are sharing a confined space under difficult conditions, and eventually the silence costs more than the words. She asked me how long I had been at Kethavar. I told her 7 months. She asked what I had been doing before. I gave her the short version, 34 years of field postings, a list of locations that would mean nothing to her. She listened to all of it. She asked about the Corps, what it was, how it worked, whether we were paid. I told her. She asked questions that were specific and intelligent, the questions of someone who understands organizational structures and is mapping one they haven't encountered before. She wanted to know how the Accord selected posting locations, how the Corps maintained neutrality agreements in contested zones, what happened when a posting went wrong in the way ours was going wrong. I answered all of it honestly. It occurred to me at some point during the middle of this that I was being assessed, not unkindly. The way a person assesses a situation they need to understand thoroughly before they commit to a position. She was taking my measure in the only way available to her, which was through questions and observation, and she was doing it with a proficiency that told me she had spent a great deal of her life doing exactly this with people she needed to understand, quickly. I asked her, carefully, not pressing, whether she was in pain beyond what I could see. She was quiet for a moment, and then said that she had been in worse pain than this, and that what she found more difficult to manage was the stillness. She was not accustomed to stillness. I said, "Neither am I, honestly." And something in her expression shifted again, that same small adjustment, the revised estimate. She said, "But you stay still when you need to." I said, "It's a learned skill." She said, "Yes." Then she looked at the Andreth window and was quiet for a while. She asked, after a pause that I had thought was the end of the conversation, what I thought about when I worked. I considered this. I told her, the immediate task, the supply inventory. What needs to be done in what order? She said, "Nothing else." I said, "Sometimes." What I didn't say, because it seemed excessive, was that I also think about the person I am treating. Not their history or their politics or what they might represent, but the specific person in front of me, the particular way their body is handling the thing that has happened to it. She seemed to intuit something of this anyway, or perhaps she simply recognized the pause. She said, "You are very much a person who is present in a moment." I said, "It's useful in this work," she said. "It is useful in any work." And then quietly, after another pause, "It is not as common as it ought to be." I thought about that for a while after she went quiet again. That afternoon, the Thale column received a communication that changed something in the outer court. I could not hear the content, but I could hear the texture of it, the way the sounds outside changed register. A column that has been operating on one assumption begins to sound subtly different when that assumption is revised. The movements change tempo. The voices carry a different weight. Breath, who by this point had established a monitoring routine, came to the anteroom and said, quietly, significant, without a qualifier. I told him I gathered. He went back to his station. Whatever the communication was, it did not result in the column moving. It resulted in the outer gate being sealed more thoroughly and additional personnel being posted at the approach to the medical wing, which was concerning in one sense and informative in another. The secondary commander did not come to see me. This I interpreted as the silence of a man with too many problems to worry about a medical post, which was either reassuring or the opposite, depending on what the problems were. She heard the change in the sounds, too. I watched her listen to it. The quality of her attention, when she was gathering information from ambient noise, was very particular, very still, the way a bird is still when it is assessing something in the middle distance. She asked me what I thought was happening. I told her what Dasev's frightened young soldier had told me the previous morning, that the column was consolidating, not passing through, because the Karev gap had been closed behind them. She looked at me specifically, not at the wall or the window, but at my face, and said, "The Karev gap was closed." "Not a question," I said. "That's what I was told," she said. "By whom?" I told her, "One of the soldiers in the treatment bay. Young, frightened, not very careful." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "And you believe it?" I told her. "I've been in enough retreating columns to recognize the sound of one, and the sounds outside had that quality." She was quiet again. Then she said, "Yes, they do." She was not surprised by this. She was not relieved by it either. She had the expression of someone receiving information that confirms a picture they had already constructed from other evidence. And the confirmation is not good news exactly, but it is at least navigable. The thing I noticed was that she did not waste time on what could not be changed. She took the information, integrated it, and moved to the question of what it implied and what it required. There are people who have this quality naturally, and people who have it because they have spent their lives in situations where not having it was too costly. I suspected, without being able to verify it, that it was the latter, that she had learned to be that way because the alternative had not been available to her. The afternoon moved slowly. The cold was steady and had the particular patience of mountain cold, which does not hurry. I did rounds of the Thale wounded, all of whom were stable, and returned to the eastern ward to write notes. She was reading. She had asked, at some point, whether there was anything in the post with print in it, and I had produced the 3 volumes from the anteroom shelf that I kept for the long nights. A history of Accord legal conventions that I had never actually read but felt I should. A field medicine reference manual that I had read many times but found reassuring in the way that very thorough things are reassuring. And a collection of geographical surveys of the border ridge that had been left by a previous postings communications officer. She had chosen the Accord legal conventions, which surprised me somewhat. She read without expression, quickly, the way a person reads a document they already know most of, but are looking for specific points. When I came back at the midday round, she was 70 pages in. I asked if it was useful. She said, "Parts of it, then. Your Accord legal scholars write as if they are afraid of clarity." I said, "They are." She looked up from the page. Said, "Why?" I said, "Because a clear law can only be violated clearly, and an ambiguous one gives everyone involved more room." She considered this. She said, "Yes, that is also true in the compact." Then she went back to reading. I ate my midday ration in the anteroom. Pellin came through and sat for a while and talked about the town he was returning to when his posting ended. A coastal settlement, 3 days. Travel from the nearest Accord hub, which he described in the specific detail of someone who has visited it repeatedly in imagination over many months. He had a way of describing the harbor market that made it very real. The smell of salt-cured fish and the specific blue of the morning light on the water, and a bakery on the north side of the square that opened before dawn and whose bread he had been thinking about for 7 months. I listened. He needed to talk about it, and I did not mind listening. It is one of the things this work teaches you. How to hold someone else's anticipation without begrudging it. When he left, I sat with the quiet for a while, and I thought about the woman in the 3rd bed, and what it meant that she was reading Accord legal conventions with that kind of focused attention, and I did not reach a conclusion that I was prepared to act on. I filed the observation and let it rest. Late in the afternoon, she put the book down and asked me something I had not anticipated. She asked whether I had family. I told her a sister, living in the Accord core systems, 3 children of her own. She asked, Do you see her? I said, when postings permit. Which is not often, she said. Does she worry about you? I said, she has learned to contain it, which is different from not worrying. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have no family left who would worry. She said it without self-pity, as a fact. The same way she said everything, precisely, without more weight than the words themselves required. I said, I'm sorry, she said. It is the condition of a certain kind of life, I said. Yes. And then neither of us said anything for a while. And it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have understood something about each other and do not need to expand upon it. The second night was the cold one. The thermal sheet I had wedged against the lintel held until approximately midnight. And then the mountain decided it had been patient long enough, and the temperature in the eastern ward dropped to something that the other patients complained about, and the Thale, wounded, requested extra blankets for, and one slept through without apparent awareness. I had one extra thermal blanket in the supply cabinet, a compromise between what the Accord had allocated and what I had argued for, and I put it across her. She had been awake, she said. You need that. I said, I have a coat, she said. So do I, somewhere. I said, your coat is in the intake wash because it had blood on it and I needed to assess whether the blood was all yours. She looked at me. Then she said, I see, and then, thank you. I sat in the chair beside the third bed that night because the anteroom chair was worse, and also because I was doing what field medics do when a patient is in genuine pain and cannot sleep, which is simply to be present. Being present is approximately 60% of what the work is, in my experience. The medicine addresses the physical situation. The presence addresses the rest of it. Most patients in that condition eventually feel the presence and relax somewhat, not because you do anything, but because the being there tells them something about the available universe that pure isolation doesn't. You are not alone in this. That is what it says when it says anything. It is not a cure. It is the thing that makes everything else slightly more survivable. She was quiet for a long time. The sounds from the outer court had changed again. The column had settled into a late-night operational rhythm that told you they were dug in, not preparing to move. I listened to it and did the calculation I always do in these situations, which is, what are my actual options, and of those, which ones do not make things worse for my patients? At some point past midnight, she said, without preamble, why do you do this work? It was dark enough in the ward that I could not see her expression clearly, only the pale gleam of her eyes in the low panel lighting that the wing kept on overnight. I said, because I'm good at it, and because it needs doing, and because those two things together seemed like enough. She was quiet for a moment. Then most people would say, because I want to help, I said. Most people would, yes, she said. You don't, I said. I help as a consequence of the work. I do the work because it's the work. The motivation isn't the satisfaction. It's the doing. She was quiet again for a long time. Then, I understand that. I believed her. Later. I do not know how much later. I had stopped tracking time with any precision by that point in the night. She said, you don't have to stay. I said, I know. She said, most people don't. I thought about that. I said, most people have somewhere to be. She said very quietly, yes, and was silent for a long while after. At some point in the early hours of the second night, she slept. I am certain it was sleep and not unconsciousness, because her breathing changed in the specific way it does. Slower, the deliberate pattern releasing into something less controlled. The small sounds of someone whose body has finally overridden the instructions their mind was giving it. I sat in the chair and listened to the mountain and thought about 34 years of this work and what it adds up to, which is a question I ask myself with some regularity at altitude in the small hours, and which I never answer satisfactorily. I was thinking about whether the supply cabinet had enough of the wound irrigation solution for the next dressing change. A practical question, the kind that keeps you from the impractical ones, when she spoke. Not loudly. She may not have been entirely awake, she said. What I believe was Ondrath Tong rather than Accord Standard. And I do not speak Ondrath, but I have worked with enough Andrath nationals that I recognize its particular cadences, the way the long vowels carry and the consonants land. She said something that sounded like a formal phrase. A phrase with structure to it, repeated meter, the quality of something recited or sworn rather than invented in the moment. A line learned young and kept somewhere below waking memory, retrievable in the borderland between sleep and not. Then she was quiet again, and I am not certain she knew she had spoken. In the morning of the third day, the Thale column's communications changed again. I know this because breath came to me at dawn with a different expression than significant. This one was something closer to watchful, the expression of a man observing a situation resolve in a direction he had not been certain of. He said that there were compact signals on the ridge approaches, multiple signals, organized movement. He said the pattern was consistent with the relief formation. He said this carefully, because relief for whom and organized by whose authority were questions he did not have answers to, and breath was too experienced to editorialize. I went to the eastern ward. She was awake, and she knew before I told her. I do not know how she knew. Whether she had been tracking ambient sound through the night, whether she had access to information I was not aware of, whether after years of being in situations like this one, the sensory pattern was familiar enough to read before anyone said a word. She was sitting up with that particular composure, and her eyes had a quality I had not seen in them during the previous 2 days. Something that was not quite relief and not quite anticipation, but had elements of both, the expression of someone who sees the end of a thing and is bracing for what the end requires of them. I told her, "There are Andrath compact signals on the ridge approaches." She said, "Yes," I said. "The Thale column will likely withdraw once they confirm the approach strength." She said. I said, "When they withdraw, you will want to be assessed again before you move." She looked at me. She said, "I know." And then, "Hest." I said, "Yes." She said, "I want to tell you something before they arrive." I said I was listening. She said, "There is a law, an old law, older than the current compact, written in the founding agreements of the Andrath throne." She said it in a chord standard, slowly, with the care of someone translating from a language that does not map cleanly. The law concerns the legitimacy of the throne in the event that the ruling queen is found without a sworn escort during a period of active conflict in Andrath-claimed territories. She said that the Thale court had argued that the territory around Kethavar Pass constituted an Andrath-claimed zone under the border annexation of 40 years ago. She said that if a queen were found alone in such a zone without sworn compact escort, the law allowed the opposing party to petition for the stripping of her throne right. She said this had been the calculation, not to harm her, but to find her compromised, to have a legal mechanism ready. A bureaucratic weapon, the kind that kills more cleanly than any column in a pass. I asked, "What prevents it?" She said, "The law also contains a witness clause, very old, older than the throne it protects. The clause states that if a sworn witness of non-compact blood, someone with no political debt to the throne, no title owed, no coercion applied, remained at the queen's side through a siege of more than 1 full day's duration, freely and without command, then the witness function supplanted the escort requirement. The intent of the original authors was to ensure that the queen's survival in extremity did not depend entirely on compact political loyalty. A neutral witness who chose to stay, with nothing to gain, fulfilled the spirit of the law more completely than a sworn escort who stayed because he was sworn." I said, "I didn't know any of this." She said, "I know. That's the point." I sat with this for a moment. I said, "How long has the Thale court known about the witness clause?" She said, "They know it exists. They believed it was a legal artifact, ceremonial, unreachable in practice. They believed that no one outside the compact would stay beside an Andrath queen in a siege under those conditions without knowing there was something to gain." I said, "They had a low opinion of field medics," she said, with a quality I had not heard from her before. Something quieter than what I would have called humor and more substantial. "Yes, they did." I thought about what she was telling me. Says, So when the compact relief formation arrives, she said, the secondary commander will file the petition. He is already preparing it. I expect his communications overnight were partly about that. And when he does, the compact will respond with the witness record. You are the witness. 2 days and 2 nights, no command, no knowledge, no political standing. It fulfills the clause more completely than any precedent in the recorded history of the law. I said, and your throne, she said, is restored by you, by the fact that you stayed. I was quiet for a while. I said, I wasn't staying for the throne, she said. I know. She said it very simply, without performance. Just I know. As if this were a fact she had assembled since over 2 days and 2 nights of watching me work, and the fact was settled and required no further discussion. I said, what is your name? And she told me. She gave me the full name. Not the common address, not the abbreviated form that the compact courts use in routine governance, not the shortened version that appears in accord communications bulletins. The full throne name, the one that is spoken aloud at the ceremony of investiture, and then formally again, only at the moment a queen formally reasserts her legitimacy in the presence of a recognized witness. It has 7 components in Ondrath Tong. Each one carries a lineage marker, a house name, a territorial designation, a function title, and 2 words at the end that are personal rather than political, chosen by the queen herself at the time of investiture, and belonging to no record except the living person. I will not write the full name here because it is not mine to write, but I heard it, all 7 parts. She said it slowly and clearly, in Ondrath Tong, the long vowels and the landing consonants, and it was not a recitation. It was the most precise thing I have ever heard a person say in 34 years of listening to people say things under difficult conditions. It had the quality of something restored to its proper place after being held out of reach for a long time. Then she said, and you may call me Saren, because that is the part that belongs to me rather than the throne. I said, Saren, she said, yes. The Thale column began withdrawing through the outer gate approximately 2 hours later. It was not a disorderly retreat. Secondary commanders who are prepared with legal filings are rarely disorganized men, but it had the particular quality of a movement that has accepted a reality it would have preferred to avoid. The secondary commander came to the medical wing before he left and stood in the anteroom with his translator and informed me, with great correctness, that the post was being returned to full accord operational status and that he appreciated the medical services rendered. He said nothing about the Eastern Ward. He filed the petition, I learned later, via encrypted transmission to the Thale High Court at some point between midnight and dawn before the compact signals appeared on the ridge. He was a thorough man. He had prepared for the moment he thought was coming and filed his instrument at what he believed was the last viable point. He was not wrong about the timeline. He was simply wrong about the clause. The compact relief formation came through the outer gate 40 minutes after the Thale withdrawal. It was not a small formation. At its head was a compact general, whose name I will not use here because it does not belong to my story. And behind him were officers and a medical team, and what I can only describe as a very large number of people whose particular attention had the quality of a held breath about to release. The formation was organized, purposeful, and had clearly been assembled to handle multiple contingencies. These were not people improvising. The general came to the Eastern Ward. He was a tall man, older than me, with the bearing of someone who has spent a significant portion of his life in a particular kind of alertness. The alertness of a person responsible for the safety of things they value above their own. He came alone into the ward initially, his officers remaining at the anteroom threshold, and there was something deliberate in that choice, something that said this moment was not for record-keeping. He walked to the ward entrance directly, without hesitation, as if the geography of the wing were already known to him. He stopped at the threshold, properly at the doorframe, not entering until he had taken in the room fully, and looked at her, and his expression did a thing that very controlled expressions sometimes do when they encounter something they were not entirely certain of finding. It went briefly still before it reorganized itself. The stillness lasted only a moment, but I had been watching people's faces under pressure for 34 years, and I know the texture of relief when it is being disciplined into something more composed. He was relieved. Whatever contingency he had prepared for instead of this, he was glad it had not come to pass. Then he looked at me. I was sitting in the chair beside the third bed. I had been sitting there because she had asked me to stay while she waited. The general looked at me for a long moment. At the blue core stripe on my sleeve, at the treatment log open on my knee, at the chair that I had clearly occupied for some considerable time. Then he looked back at her, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that was above my rank to interpret precisely. What I could read was the quality of it. A general who had come a long way in a very short time, and a queen who had not moved from a position she should not have been in, and between them the unspoken accounting of 2 days and 2 nights, and what had held and what had not. The general said, in Ondrath tongue, something formal. She responded, also formally. Then she said something that was clearly an instruction, and one of his officers produced a document, a physical document, which struck me as deliberately ceremonial, a choice to do something in the old way because the law it was fulfilling was an old law. The officer read from it. The general confirmed something. Then the general turned to me and in very careful accord standard, asked me to state my name, my accord rank and station, and whether I had remained at the post voluntarily throughout the preceding period without instruction to do so from any compact authority. I said, yes. My name is Corvin Hest, Senior Field Medic, Accord Humanitarian Corps, posted to Kethavar Citadel. I stayed because she was my patient and the post was my station. No compact authority instructed me to stay. I was not aware until this morning of any legal significance to my doing so. The officer wrote this down. The general nodded. He said something in Ondrath tongue, not to me, to her, with the quality of something confirmed, and she said something back. I caught the word for witness at the end of it, or I believe I did. Then the general and his officers withdrew to the anteroom to begin the formal process of whatever came next, and I was alone with her again for a few minutes. She was looking at the Ondrath window. The morning light came through the old pale glass and distorted itself into something abstract and luminous on the floor of the ward. She had the expression of someone who is on the far side of a very long thing and is now in the particular quiet that exists there. Not triumph, not relief entirely. Something steadier than either. The expression of a person who made a calculation in extremity, held it through 2 days of uncertainty and found it correct, and now has to absorb the fact that it was correct and move forward into what that means. I said, "What happens now?" she said. "The petition fails, legally and formally. The throne right is confirmed by the witness record. The Thale court will challenge it. They will argue the clause is ceremonial. They will argue the duration. They will argue something, and they will lose, because the law is explicit and the general will have signed the confirmation, and I will have spoken the name, and you will have stated your account, and there is nothing in the text of the writ that leaves them a viable argument. It will take time. These things always take time," I said. "And you," she said. "I go home." She said it simply, without the elaborate relief that such a sentence might seem to warrant. Just, "I go home." The same quality of precision she had brought to everything else. 2 words that had the weight of a much longer sentence behind them, all the weight of 2 days in an eastern ward in a mountain citadel, and the weight of however long before that when home had been the thing she was, working toward through conditions I did not entirely know. I said, "The ribs need 4 to 6 weeks," she said. "I have a compact medical staff," I said. "They need to know about the pain response profile. It's different for your lineage. There's a medication interaction I want to brief them on." She said, "Yes," I said, "I'll write it up." She looked at me then. She said, "Hest," I said. "Yes," she said. "You did not ask my name for 2 days," I said. "It wasn't mine to ask," she said. No, it wasn't. But I gave it to you, I said. I know, she said. I want you to understand why, not for the law, not for the witness clause. You could have said your name and stated your account without knowing mine, and the law would have been satisfied. I told you my name because, she paused, and it was the only time in 3 days that I saw her pause in the middle of a sentence, actually pause. Not for effect, but because she was choosing something carefully. Because you stayed. 2 days in a ward in a mountain citadel in a siege, with no knowledge and no reason and nothing to gain, and you stayed. And I wanted you to know who you stayed with. I did not say anything for a moment. I thought about what 34 years of this work had taught me, which is that the most significant things that happen in it almost never announce themselves at the time. They are small things, the person who finally sleeps, the breath that steadies, the moment someone lets go of something they have been holding too long. This was one of those moments, and it was recognizable, and I wanted to be present to it without diminishing it. Then I said, I'm glad I know. She said, so am I. The compact medical team came in then, and I briefed them thoroughly and wrote the medication interaction notes and answered their questions and showed them my treatment log, and she was patient with all of it and answered their questions in turn. And at some point in the middle of this, Pellin appeared in the doorway of the Eastern Ward with his logbook and the expression of a man who has witnessed several consecutive incidents that were not in his retirement plan and is managing them with dignity. One appeared behind him, assessed the situation with equanimity, and went away. She was moved to a proper medical transport before noon. The compact officers had brought one. They had come prepared for multiple contingencies, which says something about how thoroughly the compact had planned for this, even while the outcome was uncertain. I was in the outer court when the transport departed, not because there was a ceremony, but because I had gone out to assess whether the column's presence had damaged the post's outer water line, which was a legitimate concern and also a reason to be outside. The mountain air was cold and clear the way it sometimes is after a period of accumulated pressure. The citadel had the particular quiet of a place that has held something difficult and is now emptying out. The compact formation was reorganizing at the gate. Pellin was already talking to one of the officers, logbook open. One had reestablished himself in the kitchen. She was carried out in a proper medical litter. The ribs would not permit walking across the court, and I was standing by the waterline junction, and we were approximately 15 meters apart. The morning had lifted into one of those high-altitude clarities, where the sky is a very deep blue, and the stone of the citadel walls catches the light in the particular way that old granite does, as if it is slightly warmer than the air around it. She did not signal or wave, neither did I. She looked at me for a moment as the litter passed with the pale silver-gray eyes, and her expression was the one I had first encountered across the third bed in the Eastern Ward. The precise attention, the assessment, and there was something additional in it now that I am going to try to describe accurately, because this is the part I do not want to lose to time. It was recognition, not the dramatic kind, not the hand-to-mouth, eyes-overflowing recognition of the theater. Just recognition. The kind where a person looks at you and what they are conveying without words is, I see you. Not the role, not the function, not the blue stripe on the sleeve. You. And there is a weight to that, a specific gravity, that I have never adequately explained in 34 years of trying to explain things. Then, she was through the outer gate, and the transport was moving up the ridge road, and I turned back to the waterline, which had in fact sustained a small breach that needed attention. That was 4 years ago. The Thale petition failed, as she said it would, and took the better part of 8 months to do so, and the record of my account was entered into the Accord Legal Archive as part of the formal ruling, which is a strange thing to have happened to a field medic's statement about why he stayed in a ward. The Andreth Compact sent the Accord a formal commendation, which went into my file and which Pellin was very proud of, because he had retired by then, and considered the commendation partly a reflection of his administration of the post during the incident, which was not entirely wrong of him. Dasev became a senior medic in the following year. Ora transferred to a posting closer to her family. Breath got better sleep, I am told, once he moved to a station with better communications equipment. One is still at Kethavar. I have not seen her since the outer court. I do not expect to. An Andrath Queen and a core field medic occupy different parts of the universe. And both of us knew that in the Eastern Ward, and neither of us pretended otherwise. This is not a loss exactly. It is the correct shape of the thing. Some things are complete without requiring anything further from them. What I have is this: my name in a legal archive, a set of treatment notes that are now part of a Cord historical record, the medication interaction brief filed with the compact medical office, and the name. 7 components, the long vowels and the landing consonants, the part that is hers and not the throne's. I heard it spoken once in the 3rd bed in the Eastern Ward, in a mountain citadel on the 9th day of the month of Terath, in the light of an Andrath window distorting everything outside into something that resembled a painting. I have never written it down. It is not mine to write, but I remember it, completely, accurately, in the order and the weight she gave it. And I expect I always will. That is enough. That is, in fact, the whole of it.